meet all my crowd plans that I have in here. So I'm Taylor, and I'm going to be talking about mindfulness with mushrooms. The title on social media was a little different. I had a hard time really figuring out how to capture the essence of it. But basically I'm going to talk a little bit about the functions of our brain and neuroscience and how you can use that knowledge to empower yourself. And I work in education, so of course I have a learning target list for you. See some of my colleagues here today, that's awesome. Hey guys. So first we're going to talk just a little bit about basic brain science so we can understand those functions. I could talk about that for hours, but I'm going to try to go very quickly and stay within the time. We're going to talk about how trauma can impact the brain and human behavior. And then we're going to talk about inner child or parts work and how psychedelic assisted therapy can enhance that. Okay, so a few disclaimers. For starters, under the 1970 Federal Controlled Substances Act, thank you Richard Nixon, most psychedelic substances are Schedule I controlled. They are, for most purposes, illegal, and Schedule I means they're considered to have no medical value. Fun fact, Nixon actually wanted to make psychedelics Schedule I because he attributed their increased use to growing social movements during that time. I am a doctor of education. I'm not a medical doctor. I cannot resuscitate anyone, so anything that I say up here is just informational and just a part of Nerd Night, me talking about a topic that I'm passionate about. Certainly not to be medical advice or a diagnosis or anything like that. Be sure and contact a mental health professional for that. Third disclaimer. I am participating in this event on my own, and my ideas expressed here are not supported by any of the institutions in which pay my bills. So, very important. Okay, so I love this. Like I said, I could talk about it forever, but I promised myself for time I would just focus on the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex. So, here we go. Everybody see that little green dot? Raise your hand if you're familiar with the amygdala. Nice. Okay, great. I like to know my audience's knowledge base. So the amygdala is where stress lives. It's very small, but it's very powerful. It's all of our memories stored in our subconscious, our traumatic memories specifically. The amygdala has the ability to completely hijack our systems before our logic brain can even kick in, and basically send adrenaline and cortisol running through our body and send oxygen to our major muscle groups. That's so that we can fight or flight. That is what has kept the human species alive over time. Prehistoric humans, they lived in an environment where they had to hunt for their food. There was constantly enemy tribes or animals that were threats to them. So their body needed to have some sort of adaptation where they could very quickly go into fight or flight. They didn't have time to sit there and think about, oh, well, that looks friendly. So that is how humans have stayed alive. Over time, the amygdala has shrunk and the prefrontal cortex has grown, but we still have that mechanism in our brain. And it's still useful. However, we're going to talk a little bit about how sometimes what is adaptive in one environment is maladaptive in another environment. The prefrontal cortex, let me figure out, I'm not used to having a fancy laser to use. I work for the government. So prefrontal cortex, that's our thinking brain. That's where context lives. So the amygdala does not understand that you're not in danger, you're in a safe situation when it makes some sort of sensory connection in your current environment. However, you can rely on your prefrontal cortex to provide that context and be that voice in your head that says, we're safe, everything's okay, you can calm down, you know. But we're going to talk about some limitations to that as well. So that's your thinking brain. Raise your hand if you're familiar with the ACEs study, Adverse, of course, Childhood Experiences. So that was a health study that was conducted in the 90s, because they were starting to, healthcare professionals were noticing the health implications of household dysfunction. So they wanted to conduct a study to learn more about it. Basically, 2/3 of Americans have experienced at least one ACE, and 1 in 6 have experienced 4 or more ACEs. So how many people are in this room? Look to your left, look to your right. People have experienced ACEs. I'm always curious, is there someone who's never experienced any of them? I mean, like, don't raise your hand or anything, but I always think that. I'm like, are there people like that? So the 3 categories, abuse, physical, emotional, sexual, physical and emotional neglect, and then household dysfunction, violence in the home, mental illness, incarceration, substance abuse, or divorce. Interesting to me, your brain processes physical and emotional pain in the same way. So it will work just as hard to deter you from touching a it will work just as hard to deter you from entering into an emotional situation that has hurt you in the past, like intimacy or vulnerability, as it will to keep you from touching a hot stove. The brain's coding of these experiences determines the significance of the impact. So 2 siblings grow up in the same home. They may have experienced the same things, but the effects of it are very different, just because there's a lot of factors that go into how your brain codes these experiences. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that coding process as well. Also, age is very important. So year 0 to 1 is the single most important year in child development. So when you're born, you have a blank slate. Your brain is immediately firing, trying to build context and make sense of the world around it. So if you are neglected, remember the cry it out generation? Yeah, exactly. So, neglected, or there is chaos, dysfunction in the home, your brain starts to build a lens of the world. People are not safe. I cannot trust people. That's why you see sometimes children who are adopted, even if they're adopted at a very young age, will struggle with trusting other people and will have some behaviors that they'll struggle in relationships later on, because that year 0 to 1 is so impactful. But when children are very young, or when you all were very young, there are a lot of new neural pathways that are forming and making connections. And so that is why traumatic experiences matter more based on the age that you were, because you lack context. If someone is rude to you now, well, they must be having a bad day. They must hate their life. They must be miserable. A young child does not understand that. So everything gets internalized and coded as, this is what I deserve. This has to do with my self-worth. Okay, so when typically your memories every night when you go to sleep, they get processed and stored somewhere in the brain appropriately. However, young children cannot process traumatic memories in that way. So what happens is the memories end up getting stored in a way that's fragmented, and lacking context. So it's not really the exact event itself, but more the sensory experience that you had during that event. And because of that, because that sensory experience is what's stored, your triggers can come from sounds, it can come from people. Have you ever met someone and you're like, I just really don't like their vibe. Something about them just really irks me more than it should. Yeah, me all the time. Your thoughts, smells, situations, things you see in the media, places that you go, feelings. And the frustrating part is that you are typically not conscious. Your frontal cortex, your conscious brain, typically is not aware of what's happening. And that's a really difficult thing to conceptualize, in my opinion, to think that there is a part of our brain that we're not able to consciously access, but it's controlling a lot of our behaviors and predicting a lot of our patterns. But that is why these types of sensory experiences can trigger previous trauma. So your brain can make an association very quickly that your conscious brain does not understand, and you're triggered. And that cortisol rush starts, that adrenaline. But typically, you can rely on your what? Your frontal cortex to be like, what's going on with you? It's fine, like breathe or something. However, there are limitations to that. For one thing, I always like to ask this question, so I hate that I put it on the slide, but your frontal cortex is not fully developed until you are 25 to 30 years old. So when I give a similar version of this presentation in academic spaces, I always say that at school it's like a bunch of drunk kids running around interacting with each other because they don't have a fully developed frontal cortex. Which brings me to my next point. Alcohol impacts its ability to function. So whenever you are drinking alcohol, you are shutting down your prefrontal cortex. So that little voice in your head that when somebody irritates you or irks you or says something short to you, and that voice in your head that's like, we need this job, it's fine, she's having a bad day, whatever, move on. That's the frontal cortex talking. But when you're drinking, you're much more likely to be emotionally reactive because you lose the ability to enact that voice. So if you might know someone who if someone has a lot of emotional baggage, it's probably not a good idea that they get drunk. And you might know somebody like that. And if you don't, then you do now. So trauma also impacts the development of the frontal cortex, and it can impact the connections that are made. So really interesting that I actually just read about recently is that when you are young and your brain is forming all these connections and you live in a home where you experience or witness physical or emotional abuse, your brain can literally create a neural connection, a neural pathway connection between love and pain. And that really comes back and kicks you in your ass later in life, if you know what I'm saying. So what happens when there's a trigger? So when there's a trigger that comes up, if you are able to access your frontal cortex and calm yourself down, you have about 90 seconds to do that. Luckily for most of us, there's a level of automaticity that comes with that. We're automatically like, okay, what's going on with you? Calm down, because we're used to doing that. However, also sometimes the trigger is pinging on something that is so emotionally overwhelming that your frontal cortex is not able to calm you down enough. And that's when people, have things like panic attacks or feel themselves start to really, breathing gets shallow, all the things. Instinctive trauma responses, the fight response, that can look like actual fighting or it can look like defensiveness, arguing, voice gets loud over something that's not merited. Flight response, escape, get away from the situation. Freeze, you just don't react at all, say nothing. And then the fawn response, which is almost more of like a coping mechanism, but that's people that you see that struggle with people pleasing. They learned at an early age that if they are constantly pleasing the people around them, that will keep them emotionally and physically safe. And so they just continue that on into their adult life. They're always apologizing. They're constantly outside of themselves, trying to make sure everyone else is happy. And they've really lost sight of who they are and what their wants and needs are. And then this is my favorite quote from a book called What Happened to You? And I said it a minute ago, but what is adaptive in one environment becomes maladaptive in another. Because the subconscious brain, where these traumatic memories are stored, and also where that amygdala that has all that power to hijack you is located, it doesn't understand the passage of time. So it cannot, again, frontal cortex is where that context is. So it doesn't understand, oh, we're no longer in a war zone. We're no longer living in that dysfunctional home. And so it's going to keep triggering you because it thinks that that's the way to keep you safe. So you will avoid things that could cause you more pain. And it works just as hard to avoid emotional pain as it does physical pain. The problem with that is oftentimes you end up living a life much smaller than you would like because that voice in your head is saying, no, we don't need to take that risk. We don't need to do that. We just need to stick to our patterns and what we know. Your brain would prefer to stay in situations that are familiar to it even if they're unhealthy, because it knows already how to navigate it. And again, this is all part of that subconscious brain that you don't necessarily have access to. So what is emotional dysregulation? What does that look like? Impulsivity, always, low dopamine levels, so always looking for a dopamine hit. Online shopping, social media, constantly scrolling on social media, always looking for something that's going to make you feel good in the moment. Part of that is also because people that struggle with emotional dysregulation and are always looking to feel good outside of themselves because they have never learned how to give themselves what they need. We're going to talk a little bit more about that. Problems in relationships, both romantic and platonic, attempts to avoid or numb, a lot of self-judgment, a harsh inner critic in your head always criticizing you. It's crazy because if you've had that your whole life, you don't know that other people are like not experiencing that, so you just think that's a universal experience. Anxiety about the emotional dysregulation, the more you become aware of it, judgments of other people. And then difficulty thinking through problems and problem solving or thinking long term because you're in the moment just thinking, thank you so much for the head nodding you're giving me because you're really giving me life. And my own people aren't doing it, but and then just issues with thinking long term or big picture because you're constantly living in the moment. I don't feel good, how can I feel good in the now? So I talked a little bit about this already, but what are fragmented memories? They're unclear, they're fuzzy, again, because those traumatic memories are stored often without an overall context. And then when they're triggered, again, doesn't understand the passage of time, and it's stored based on your sensory experiences in that traumatic moment. And if you they call it CPTSD now, which is, there was ongoing trauma or dysfunction, so there's a lot of events, it's not just one. And these include intense emotion and body sensations. Those are your triggers. So when you start to learn, the beautiful thing about understanding all of this is when you do, you use time signaling me? Okay, so when you do, you start to recognize what it is, you can get curious about it. Okay, EMDR is, raise your hand if you've heard of EMDR. Okay, so here's the science of it, but here's what finally clicked for me and helped me understand it. So those memories that are in your subconscious, your body has decided that because they are too painful and emotionally overwhelming, it's going to block you from accessing those. And so the pain is the pain of a 5-year-old or a 7-year-old or a 10-year-old. It's not adult pain because all of your memories are stored based on your frame of reference, your context, and your age that you were when it occurred. So EMDR is supposed to mimic REM in sleep. So you can do this or they'll do this, which like you're being hypnotized or something. And it's supposed to help you slow down that overstimulated amygdala so you can actually reach and process a traumatic memory. So what they do, a licensed professional, what they do is they'll ask you to think about a core self-belief that you would like to change about yourself. So it could be related to your self-worth or whatever. And when you do that and you can really let go, you'll notice that your brain will just go on a loop and it will show you all the times that you've ever felt that way. And it will make connections to events that you didn't even know were related. And I've done it and it's incredible. So it goes through this loop and then it wants you to get as far back as you can, ideally to that core memory where that neural connection was made that formed that self-belief. And then it's like you watch it from your adult perspective. When you can access that memory, your adult brain watches it, and you think to yourself, that's an 8-year-old. Who else do I know that's 8? That's a baby. That wasn't my fault. Those are bad people. That wasn't me. And you have this empathy and love for yourself that you've never been able to find before, and it's an incredible and powerful experience. And when you're able to do that, a memory at a time, you'll find that it's like a weight has been lifted. That's where the mushroom part comes in. So there is a lot of research out there on psychedelic assisted therapy. Basically, those psilocybin increases neural connectivity. So again, when you're young, there's a lot of connections being made, not as many as you get older. Psilocybin, I think it's like 10 times or 20 times more the connections. It fires that up, activates that again in your brain so you can make new connections and rewire your brain. And also psychedelics like psilocybin and LSD, they enter the brain and the same receptors as serotonin. So when your body is filled with that feel-good hormone, you're relaxed enough where you can access powerful memories and process them. Because otherwise your brain will say, nope, we're not doing that. I'm not going to let you connect with that emotionally. So psychedelic drugs can be used in therapy to allow the person to better access and process memories that may otherwise be too painful to connect to. So that's where parts work comes in. Once you start that process of going back in your memories and connecting with that smaller version of you, you can do that work on your own. Yes, that is actually me. You can, and it's funny because I've always struggled with vulnerability, and a therapist told me about this once and explained it, and I was like, girl, what? I am not doing that. That is ridiculous. But it's actually really incredible once you start. Because it's like when you feel a trigger come up or you feel something come up, these negative thoughts, and you connect with that part of yourself. Basically, inner child work is just personifying the subconscious. So the subconscious is where all those memories are trapped, and it's a way to personify it so you can connect with it and find love and empathy for yourself. And I can just literally, when I do it, I can just like feel the serotonin and the tingly, happy feeling run over me. It's amazing. So signs of a wounded inner child inside of you, reactivity, depression, anxiety, all the things. So I took all the words off and just kind of gave you some examples there. So basically what you're doing when you go back and you find memories and you look at them through your adult perspective is you are recoding or rewiring your brain, which is incredible. And when you again, it's your adult perspective, so those old false narratives that your 14 or 4-year-old self came up with to cope, you can change those, and so then the lens in which you see everything will completely change. It's amazing. Practices like EMDR, cognitive behavior therapy, psychedelic assisted therapy, they can all help a person to process those painful memories and change their life. So think about it as shift. See that inner child through your mind's eye, hold space for them. When the tightness in your chest or those feelings come up, think about what is this about? Where is this coming from? Where is this stemming from? And give yourself empathy instead of shame. Not this again. You're always upset about something. Pay attention to the voices in your head and how you talk to yourself, because it really matters. And you're talking to those younger trapped parts of you as well. Journaling is really powerful with this. So what happens when you actually start to embrace some of these practices? That lens in which you see everything starts to shift, and you don't see everything through a lens of fear. You start to take more risks. You become better being present with the people that you love. You become more comfortable meeting new people, and you start to knock those things off your bucket list because you're not, you're not being held back by your trauma. Okay. And then these are some ways that you can connect with me. And then here, if you're interested, some recommendations on Netflix to learn more about psilocybin and other psychedelic therapies, some podcasts that I love on it, and then some Audible or readings. The Body Keeps the Score is amazing. So, that's it.